The day Clara Hart stood up in that crowded hall and refused to be silent was the day everything in Redemption Creek changed forever, and nobody in that dusty Texas town would ever forget it. It was the autumn of 1882, and the land around Redemption Creek had turned the color of old copper coins, the tall grasses bending under a wind that carried the smell of distant rain and dried earth. The town sat at the edge of the hill country, a modest collection of buildings that had risen from nothing over the past 15 years, a general store, a blacksmith, a church with a crooked steeple, a saloon that did more business than the church, and a courthouse that doubled as a meeting hall when the occasion demanded. Redemption Creek was not a grand place, but it was the kind of town that people worked hard to keep, and they felt a particular pride in it that came from the fact that they had built it themselves. Clara Hart was 29 years old, and she had been a widow for 8 months. Her husband, Thomas Hart, had been a good man, a farmer who had put everything he had into 40 acres of land on the southern edge of town. He had died of a fever in the late winter, fast and cruel, leaving Clara with their 7-year-old son, Benjamin, and the land Thomas had loved more than he had loved anything else in the world except his wife and his boy. The farm was mortgaged to the Redemption Creek Savings and Land Trust, which was run by a man named Gerald Morrow, and the debt was not small. Clara had spent the 8 months since Thomas's death doing what women in her position were expected to do, which was to grieve quietly, to manage as best she could, and to hope that the men around her would be fair. She had worked the farm with Benjamin at her side, planting and harvesting the small kitchen garden that kept them fed, selling eggs and preserves in town, taking in mending and laundry from the wealthier households. She had paid 3 payments on the mortgage without being late by a single day. She had done everything right. But now Gerald Morrow had brought a proposal to the town meeting, and that proposal was the thing that had driven Clara to put on her best dress, pin her dark hair back with the tortoiseshell comb Thomas had given her for her birthday, take Benjamin's hand, and walk into that courthouse with her jaw set and her eyes dry. The courthouse was full. Nearly every man in Redemption Creek had come, which was the usual way of things. Town meetings were men's business, and women came sometimes, but they sat near the back and they listened, and they did not often speak. Clara took a seat near the middle of the room, which was itself a quiet declaration. Benjamin sat next to her, his legs too short to reach the floor, his eyes moving around the room with the observant calm of a child who had learned early to read the mood of a room. Gerald Morrow stood at the front. He was a man of 50, broad through the chest, with a neat gray mustache and the kind of confident bearing that came from having money and the respect that money bought. He wore a good suit, and he spoke in the measured tones of a man who expected to be listened to. The proposal was this. The creek that ran along the western boundary of several properties in Redemption Creek, including Clara's farm, had been feeding a modest spring that was the only reliable water source for a stretch of about 6 properties. Morrow wanted to redirect that water. He had acquired land upstream, and he intended to build a larger operation there. He called it a processing facility, something to do with the cattle that passed through on the trail routes, and he needed the water rights that currently served those 6 properties. His proposal to the town was that the council vote to reassign the water rights to his upstream parcel, with the understanding that he would compensate the affected landowners with a one-time payment. The one-time payment he named was not enough, not for Clara's land. Without reliable water, the 40 acres Thomas had built his dreams on would be worth nothing within a season. She had done the arithmetic in her head that morning while Benjamin ate his breakfast, and she had done it again on the walk into town, and it came out the same every time. The payment Morrow was offering would not cover what she still owed on the mortgage, and without water she would not be able to farm the land, and without farming the land she would have nothing left to pay anything with. It would be the end of everything Thomas had worked for. It would be the end of everything she had been working for since the day they buried him. Morrow finished his presentation and nodded to Council Chairman Horace Prout, a thin man with spectacles who ran the meeting with the efficiency of a man who wanted to get home in time for supper. Prout asked if there were questions. Two of the other affected landowners spoke. Both men. One was resigned, the other was cautiously optimistic, as though the payment seemed fair enough to him. Neither of them had Clara's specific situation. Neither of them had a mortgage held by Morrow's own bank. Clara stood up. She did it without wavering, rising to her feet in the middle of the room, her spine straight, her hands folded in front of her. The room noticed her, the way it always noticed when something unexpected happened. "I have something to say about this matter," Clara said clearly. Her voice was steady, and she was grateful for that, because her heart was doing something frantic behind her ribs. Horace Prout looked at her over his spectacles with the expression of a man confronted by something mildly inconvenient. "Mrs. Hart," he said, in the tone men used when they were attempting to be gentle while also being dismissive, "we appreciate your attendance, but this is a matter for the council to determine." "This matter affects my property directly," Clara said. "My land borders that creek on the south side. I have a right to speak to this." Gerald Morrow turned in his chair to look at her, and his expression was not unkind, but it was the kind of not unkind that was really just another form of dismissal. "Mrs. Hart, you'll be well compensated. The amount I've proposed is fair." "The amount you've proposed does not cover what I owe your bank," Clara said, and the room went a little quieter. "Without water, that land cannot produce. Without production, I cannot make payments, and the land your bank holds as security against my mortgage will be worth nothing once you've taken the water. So what you are proposing is that I accept a payment that will not clear my debt, lose my means of income, and then presumably default on the mortgage, at which point your bank takes the land anyway." The room was very quiet now. "Mrs. Hart," Horace Prout said, with less gentleness and more impatience, "this is not the appropriate venue for personal financial disputes. The council is here to discuss water rights as a matter of town policy, not to adjudicate individual. I am raising a point that is directly relevant to the policy being discussed," Clara said, and her voice was stronger now, not louder but stronger, the way a current in a river gets stronger when the banks narrow. "If this council votes to approve Mr. Morrow's proposal, it will do so with the knowledge that the compensation being offered is structured in a way that benefits Mr. Morrow twice, once through the water rights and once through the resulting foreclosures. That is not a neutral policy matter. That is a conflict of interest, and the town ought to know it. Sit down, Mrs. Hart." Prout said it flatly this time, all gentleness gone. "This is not the place for this kind of accusation. Now sit down and let the council proceed." Several heads in the audience nodded in the easy way that people nod when the path of least resistance is being laid out before them. Clara felt the heat in her face, and for one terrible moment she thought she might simply obey, the way years of being in rooms like this one had trained her to obey, and that thought made her angrier than anything else had. She drew breath to speak again, and then a voice came from the back of the room. Let her speak. It was not a loud voice. It was a quiet one, actually, which was part of what made it so effective, because quiet voices in noisy rooms have a particular quality of command that shouting rarely achieves. Every head in the room turned. The man who had spoken was leaning against the back wall with his hat in his hands. He was tall, with a lean build that spoke of outdoor work and long days in the saddle. He had dark eyes and a jaw that had not been shaved in 2 or 3 days, and he was dressed in the practical clothing of a working cowboy: canvas trousers, a flannel shirt the color of a faded sky, worn boots that had seen real miles. He looked to be in his mid-30s, and he had the quiet, self-contained bearing of a man who was not easily rattled. Clara did not know him. She had never seen him before in her life. Horace Prout stared at him. "I beg your pardon. I said let her speak," the man repeated, pushing off from the wall and straightening to his full height. He was not aggressive about it, not threatening, just present and deliberate, the way a fence post stands in a field unmovable, not by any drama but by simple solidity. She's raised a legitimate point about a conflict of interest. Seems like a town meeting is exactly the right place for that, unless you've got a reason you'd rather not hear it. That last part landed in the room like a stone dropped in still water. Several men shifted in their seats. Gerald Morrow's expression shifted slightly. "And who are you?" Prout asked. "Wallace Atkins," the man said. "I've been working for Dan Hollies at the Double H for the past 3 months. I'm not a voting member of this council, but I've got ears like everyone else in this room, and what this woman is saying makes sense, and she deserves to be heard." Clara stood very still. She was looking at this stranger, this Wallace Atkins, and something in his plain directness, his absolute unperturbed insistence that she had the right to be heard, did something strange to the tight knot of anxiety that had been sitting in her chest since she had walked through the courthouse door that evening. It did not dissolve it, but it shifted it, made room around it. Horace Prout looked at the room. The room was looking at Wallace Atkins, and then back at Clara Hart, and there was a current of something running through it that Prout was experienced enough to read. These were practical people. Clara's argument was simple, and they had heard it and they were thinking about it. Prout cleared his throat. "Mrs. Hart," he said, with considerably less authority than before, "you have the floor for 3 minutes." Clara spoke for 3 minutes. She was precise and she was clear, and she said nothing she could not back up with fact. And when she was done, she sat down, and Benjamin put his small hand in her lap, and she put her hand over his without looking away from the front of the room. The council did not vote that evening. Prout tabled the proposal for further review, citing the need for additional information regarding the compensation structure, and the meeting dispersed with a restlessness that Clara recognized as the early stages of people changing their minds. It was not a victory, not yet, but it was not the defeat that had seemed certain an hour before. Outside, the night air was cool and smelled of cedar and coming rain. Clara stood on the steps of the courthouse with Benjamin beside her, people moving around them on their way to horses and wagons and the warm lamplight of homes. She was still holding the tension in her body, coiled like a spring, because she knew this was not over. "Mrs. Hart," she turned. It was Wallace Atkins, standing at the bottom of the steps with his hat in his hands, and up close he looked different than he had at the back of the room, not more or less imposing, just more human somehow, more particular. She could see that his dark eyes had a kind of direct attentiveness in them, the look of a man who actually listened when people spoke. His hat was a good one but old, with a crease in the brim that told her he handled it a lot, a nervous habit maybe. "Mr. Atkins," she said, "I just wanted to say you made a good argument in there. A sound one." He was straightforward about it, not flattering her, not condescending to her, just offering the assessment plainly. "Thank you," she said. "And thank you for what you said, in there." Something moved across his face. It was not quite embarrassment and not quite discomfort. It was something closer to honesty. It needed saying. "Prout had no right to shut you down like that. Many people in that room would disagree with you about that," Clara said, with a dryness that surprised even herself, and the corner of his mouth tipped upward. "Many people in that room are wrong," he said simply. Benjamin was looking up at Wallace with the frank curiosity of a 7-year-old. "Are you a real cowboy?" he asked. Wallace looked down at him with the same direct attentiveness he had shown Clara. "I work cattle," he said. "Whether that makes me a real one depends on who's asking, I suppose." "I'm asking," Benjamin said. "Then yes," Wallace said, and there was warmth in it, genuine warmth. Clara put her hand on Benjamin's shoulder. "We should be getting home, it's late." She looked at Wallace. "Thank you again, Mr. Atkins, truly." "Wallace," he said. "Mr. Atkins was my father," she almost smiled. "Good night, Wallace." "Good night, Mrs. Hart." She took Benjamin's hand and they walked to the wagon she had tied on the street, and she did not look back, but she was aware of the weight of his gaze the same way you are aware of warmth from a fire when you step away from it. You notice it most in the moment it's gone. The weeks that followed were not easy ones, but they were different from the weeks that had come before them. Clara found herself with unexpected allies in the effort to oppose Gerald Morrow's water rights proposal. Two other landowners who had initially seemed inclined to accept the compensation came back around after talking among themselves and realized the holes in Morrow's arrangement. An attorney in the next town over named Strickland, who occasionally passed through Redemption Creek, took an interest in the conflict of interest angle Clara had raised and wrote a letter to the county commissioner's office in San Antonio. And somehow, across the ordinary routes that information traveled in small western towns, the general store, the blacksmiths, the church steps on Sunday morning, word spread that Clara Hart had stood up at the town meeting and said something worth hearing, and that a cowboy from the Double H had stood up and said so. And that combination of courage and plain-spoken justice had a way of sticking in people's minds. Wallace Atkins kept riding for Dan Holly's at the Double H, which sat about 4 miles east of Clara's farm, and the distance was not large enough to make their paths unlikely to cross. The first crossing came 6 days after the town meeting, when Clara was driving her wagon into town for supplies and found a horse and rider at the side of the road. The horse had pulled up lame. She recognized the horse first, a good roan she had noticed tied at the courthouse, and then she recognized the man beside it, crouching to examine the animal's left foreleg with careful hands. She pulled her wagon alongside. That the same horse from the other night. Wallace looked up and something in his expression eased when he saw it was her. Yes, ma'am, picked up a stone. She'll be fine, she just needs to walk the rest of the way. The Double H is east, Clara said. Town is west. Which direction are you headed? Town, he said. Errand for Holly's. I'm going that way myself. Put her on the back and ride in the wagon if you want to save the horse some steps. He considered for a moment, and she could see him weighing the offer the way a careful man weighs any unexpected kindness, not with suspicion exactly, but with the particular thoughtfulness of someone who does not take things for granted. I'd be obliged, he said. He tied the roan to the back of the wagon and climbed up beside her, settling with a natural ease that did not crowd her, and they drove into town with the October sky spread wide and blue above the road. They talked about the water rights situation, because it was the obvious topic and Clara had learned that dancing around obvious things was a waste of time. He asked good questions, the kind that showed he had been thinking about it. He knew something about land law, more than most cowboys would, and when she asked about it, he said that he had spent a few years working for a land surveyor in his 20s and had learned more than he had expected to about how property changed hands in the West. That's an unusual background for a working cowboy, she said. I've had an unusual amount of occupations, he said, without any trace of defensiveness. I've never been good at staying in one place when there's something else to learn somewhere else. How old are you? She asked, because she was direct by nature and the question was relevant to the shape she was making of him in her mind. 34, he said. She nodded. And how long will you stay at the Double H? He was quiet for a moment and the wagon rolled through the cedar-scented morning air, and when he answered his voice had a different quality, slower, more considered. I'm not sure yet, he said. It depends on some things. She did not ask what things. Some questions you do not ask on a wagon ride into town when you have known a person for less than a week. In town, they parted on the main street and she watched him take the roan to the farrier before she went into the general store. Inside, Martha Dunn, who ran the store with her husband and had ears tuned to the frequency of local business the way other people tuned instruments, gave Clara a look that said more than words would have. That Wallace Atkins I saw you come in with, Martha asked, already reaching for the bolt of blue muslin Clara had ordered. He had a lame horse, Clara said simply. Martha made a sound that managed to contain an entire editorial about the matter, without using a single syllable that could be quoted back to her. November arrived with cold nights and days that were still warm at noon, the kind of weather that felt like the land trying to hold onto something before winter. Clara began to see Wallace more regularly, in the small ways that proximity and shared circumstance create at church on Sundays, where he had started attending, sitting near the back in the quiet way he did most things, at the general store on Saturday mornings. Once, unexpectedly, at her fence line, where she found him one afternoon mending a section of rail that had gone down in a wind. She pulled up short when she saw him, because she had not been expecting anyone, and he straightened and took off his hat. "I hope this isn't overstepping," he said. "I was riding past and I saw it down and I had wire in my bag." She looked at the fence, which he had fixed with the kind of neat competence that spoke of long practice, and then she looked at him, standing in the afternoon light with his hat in his hands and that direct, honest gaze of his. "It isn't overstepping," she said. "Thank you." "I know you've got a lot to manage on your own," he said, and it was not pity that was in his voice, which she would not have been able to stand. It was just observation, the plain recognition of a real circumstance. "If there are things around the property that need doing, I've got time most evenings after the work at the Double H is finished." She studied him for a moment. "Why?" she asked. He seemed to be asking himself the same question and deciding to answer it honestly. "Because you're in a hard situation that you didn't create for yourself," he said. "And because watching Prout try to shut you down at that meeting made me angrier than I've been in a while. And because," he stopped, and there was a quality to that stop that made her very still. "Because I'd like an excuse to be here," he finished, quietly, and the honesty of it was almost startling. Clara looked at him for a long moment. Her chest did the same confusing thing it had done in the week since the town meeting, the thing she had been trying to attribute to gratitude or stress or the general unsettled quality of her life, and she was beginning to have to admit to herself that it was not any of those things. "I'll make coffee," she said, "and you can tell me what else needs doing around the place." They drank coffee at her kitchen table while Benjamin did his lessons on the floor by the stove, and Wallace walked through her property after and showed her 3 other things that needed attention. A rotting post on the barn, a gap in the roof of the chicken coop where cold air was getting in, a section of the irrigation channel from the creek that had silted up and was reducing the water flow. He was methodical and matter-of-fact about all of it, and she listened and made mental notes, and was aware, with a kind of quiet clarity, that she was enjoying his company in a way that had nothing to do with the practical information he was providing. He started coming by 2 or 3 evenings a week. He worked and she worked, and Benjamin trailed after him with the devotion that 7-year-old boys reserve for men who take them seriously, and in the evenings they drank coffee, or sometimes tea, and talked. They talked about Thomas, because she wanted to, and because Wallace was the kind of man who could hear about another man's life and death without making it into something uncomfortable. They talked about Wallace's own history. He had grown up in Tennessee, had come west at 19, had worked land surveys and cattle drives, and a stint as a deputy in a small Oklahoma town that had lasted 6 months before the politics of the thing had made him quit. He had no family living, both parents gone, a brother who had died young. He had been wandering for long enough that he had almost forgotten what it felt like to not be wandering. "Does it bother you?" Clara asked one evening. The wandering. He thought about it carefully, which she had learned was his way with everything worth thinking about. "It used to feel like freedom," he said. "Lately it feels more like habit." She looked at him across the table, the lamp between them throwing warm light across the lines of his face, and she said, "What would make you stop?" He looked back at her, and the answer was in his eyes before it was anywhere else, clear as water. "I think I'm looking at it," he said. She set down her coffee cup. Her heart was doing the frantic thing again, but this time she did not try to name it something other than what it was. "Wallace," she said, "I'm still working out who I am without Thomas." "It's only been 8 months. "I know that," he said. "I'm not asking you to be done working it out. I'm just asking if I can be here while you do." That was everything. That was precisely the right thing, and he probably knew it, and she probably knew that he knew it, and she nodded once, slowly, and something settled between them with the quiet finality of something put down in the right place. The water rights battle came to a head in early December. Attorney Strickland returned from San Antonio with a response from the county commissioner's office that was more favorable than Clara had dared hope. The office had concerns about the conflict of interest that Clara had identified, and it put the approval of Morrow's proposal on hold pending a review. It was not a resolution, but it was a stay, and it bought time. Gerald Morrow was not pleased. He appeared at Clara's door on a gray December morning, arriving in his buggy with his neat gray mustache and his good suit, and he knocked with the confidence of a man who was accustomed to the world rearranging itself to his specifications. Clara opened the door. She did not invite him in. "Mrs. Hart," he said, "I think we can resolve this matter simply, between ourselves, without involving county officials and creating headaches for everyone involved. I'm prepared to increase the compensation offer by 15%. That still doesn't address the underlying conflict," Clara said. "Your bank holds my mortgage and your proposal benefits from my loss." "No compensation figure changes that fact." Morrow's expression tightened slightly. "You're being unreasonable. Most women in your position would take what's being offered and be grateful." "Most women in my position don't have 3 months of experience studying land law," Clara said, and Morrow blinked, thrown off his script. She had learned that from Wallace, not the knowledge itself, but the confidence to deploy it. "This won't go anywhere for you," Morrow said, and his voice had cooled. "You're a widow with a mortgaged farm and a 7-year-old boy. I am simply describing your circumstances, Mrs. Hart, not threatening you." "I know the difference," Clara said evenly. "Good morning, Mr. Morrow." She closed the door. She leaned her back against it for a moment, letting her breath out slowly, and when she turned, Benjamin was standing in the kitchen doorway watching her with his wide brown eyes. "Was that the man who wants to take our water?" he asked. "Yes," she said. "What are you going to do?" She pushed off the door and went to start the stove. "I'm going to keep fighting," she said. Wallace arrived that evening to find her at the kitchen table with the mortgage papers spread out in front of her, and she told him about Morrow's visit. He listened to the whole of it without interrupting, and when she was finished he sat for a moment with his hands around his coffee cup and his eyes on the table. "He'll try to find another angle," Wallace said. "If the county blocks the water rights, he'll look for leverage somewhere else. Has he been applying any pressure on the mortgage payments?" "Everything has been paid on time," Clara said. "I've been meticulous about it." "Good, keep it that way." He looked at her. "I've been thinking about something. I have some savings. Not a great deal, but enough. If we could find a way to refinance the mortgage with a different institution, Morrow loses his leverage entirely." She was very still. "Wallace, I can't let you. I'm not proposing to give you anything," he said, firmly but gently. "I'm proposing to think creatively about the problem. There's a land bank in Austin. I've dealt with them before. Their terms are fair. If the current mortgage balance could be transferred, even with your savings and mine combined as a down payment, that's still a significant amount of your money in my problem," she said. "Clara." He said her name in a particular way, carefully and deliberately, as though he was accustomed to treating things that mattered to him with care. "It is not just your problem. Not anymore." She looked at him for a long time, reading the truth of him, the patience and the steadiness and the plain, unadorned affection that had been building in him for weeks, visible in everything he did, in the careful way he worked her land, and the careful way he listened to her, and the careful way he looked at her when he thought she was not looking back. She had been watching it the same way you watch weather moving across a hill, knowing it is coming, feeling it in the air, and her own answering feeling had been growing at the same pace. "We'll call it an investment," she said finally. "And when this is settled, I'll pay you back every cent." "When this is settled, we can discuss the terms at length," he said, and the warmth in his eyes was quiet and deep and entirely his. They wrote to the Austin Land Bank the following morning, and Clara sent the letter with the afternoon post rider. December moved through its short cold days, and Clara and Wallace fell into a rhythm that felt both new and entirely natural, the way the best things do. He was at the farm most evenings, and on Saturday afternoons Benjamin had acquired the habit of sitting on the fence and watching Wallace work, with the kind of reverent concentration that children apply to things they love. One Saturday he asked Wallace to teach him to throw a loop, and Wallace spent an hour in the cold yard with a length of rope, patient and steady and laughing when Benjamin's loop went sideways and caught the fence post instead of the target post, and Clara watched from the porch with her shawl around her shoulders and her heart absolutely full. She had not expected this. She had not planned for it, had not wanted it, or had told herself she hadn't, because wanting it had seemed like a kind of betrayal of Thomas and also a kind of naivety. A widow with a mortgaged farm and a little boy believing a wandering cowboy would choose to stop. But here it was, happening anyway, unhurried and true, and she was finding that she did not want to argue with it anymore. Christmas came to Redemption Creek in the way it always did, with a brightness that seemed disproportionate to the small scale of the place. The church strung with cedar boughs, the general store window painted with scenes that Martha Dunn redid every year and which were not technically skillful but were enthusiastic and beloved. The town had not forgotten the water rights dispute, but it had moved into the background the way ongoing battles do, becoming a fact of life rather than an emergency. The county review was proceeding. Strickland was managing the correspondence. And Clara, for the first time in months, had allowed herself to stop holding her breath for long stretches of time. Wallace had been invited to Christmas dinner, and he arrived with a tied bundle under his arm that contained a new length of rope for Benjamin and a small volume of poetry for Clara, which surprised her because she had not had him down as a poetry reader. When she said so, he smiled. "My mother read it," he said. "I picked up the habit from her. She was a reader." Clara held the small volume, which was Tennyson, and she looked up at him in the warm kitchen with the smell of roasted meat and pine filling the air and Benjamin clattering around somewhere in the other room, and something moved through her that was so clear and uncomplicated that she almost laughed from the relief of it. "Thank you," she said, and meant it in a way that was bigger than the book. They sat at her table with Benjamin between them, and they ate the Christmas meal she had made: roasted chicken and sweet potatoes and biscuits, and a jar of blackberry preserves she had been saving. And Wallace told Benjamin a story about a Christmas he had spent on a cattle drive south of Abilene, and Benjamin listened with his fork suspended halfway to his mouth, riveted, and Clara watched them both and let herself have the happiness of it. After Benjamin was in bed, they sat by the fire and she read him 2 poems from the Tennyson and he told her which ones he liked and why, with the same thoughtful attentiveness he brought to everything. And at some point the conversation moved into quiet and they sat in the quiet, and it was the best possible kind of quiet, the kind that does not need to be filled. "Wallace," she said into the fire. He said, which was his sound of attention, "I need you to know something." She looked at him. "I'm not good at saying things like this, or at least I haven't been, because for a long time saying things felt dangerous. Like if you said too much of what was true out loud it could be taken from you." She paused. "But I think I know that what I feel for you is real, and I didn't expect it, and I fought it harder than I'm proud of, and I want you to know that I have stopped fighting it." He was very still. His face had the quality it always had when he was being careful with something important. "I love you," he said, quietly and absolutely. She had known it. She had been watching it build for months. But hearing it was different from knowing it, and she sat with it for a moment, letting it be real. "I love you too," she said. He reached across and took her hand, and that was all, just her hand in his, warm and steady, and the fire burning low, and outside the wide dark of the Texas night. It was enough. It was everything. The response from the Austin Land Bank came in January, and it was favorable. The terms were clear and fair, and the interest rate was considerably better than Morrow's. They would need to travel to Austin to complete the transaction, which was a 2-day journey, and Clara arranged for Benjamin to stay with Martha Dunn and her husband, for the 3 days the trip would require. They rode to Austin in Wallace's wagon, which was newer and sturdier than Clara's, with a third horse tied behind so they could make reasonable time. The hill country in January was cold and spare and beautiful, the cedar dark green against the pale grass and pale sky, and they talked for much of the 2 days of travel the way people talk when they are building a shared life, about practical things, about ideas, about memories and hopes, the conversation weaving back and forth with the easy continuity of something that had no beginning you could put your finger on. In Austin, they stayed at a respectable boarding house on Congress Avenue, in separate rooms, which was the only proper way of things, and which Clara insisted on without embarrassment. The next morning they went to the land bank offices, which smelled of ink and wood polish and the particular seriousness of financial institutions, and by noon the paperwork was signed and the refinancing was arranged. Clara folded the documents with hands that were steadier than she had expected and put them in her bag and walked out of the bank into the Austin winter sunshine. Wallace was beside her. She stopped on the pavement and turned to him. "It's done," she said. "It's done," he agreed. She took his hand right there on Congress Avenue with Austin moving around them, horses and wagons and the noise of a growing city, and she did not care who saw. He looked down at their joined hands and then up at her, and his eyes were bright. They arrived back in Redemption Creek the following evening, and the first thing Clara did was go to the courthouse and file the documentation that removed Gerald Morrow's bank from the title of her mortgage. The second thing she did was collect Benjamin from the Dunns and hold him until he complained. Gerald Morrow heard about the refinancing within 2 days, because small towns are efficient that way, and Clara suspected that whatever advantage he had been hoping to leverage through the mortgage was now gone. The county review came to its conclusion in February, finding that the original water rights proposal presented a structural conflict of interest that could not be remedied by compensation adjustments alone. Morrow was invited to resubmit a revised proposal that addressed the conflict, and the revised proposal, when it came, excluded Clara's property and the 2 neighboring properties whose owners had been most vocal, redirecting the proposed facility to draw from a different water source entirely. It was not a perfect outcome, but it was a fair one, and it preserved the creek for Clara's land. On the day the final order came through from the county, Clara read it at her kitchen table and then sat quietly with it for a long moment. 8 months of fighting, Thomas's land still hers, the water rights protected, the mortgage in the hands of an institution that had no reason to work against her. She thought about Thomas, and she let herself do that fully, the way she had been doing it more freely since Wallace had arrived in her life, because one of the unexpected gifts of loving someone new was that it had given her back the ability to love the person she had lost without the love turning immediately to grief. Thomas had worked so hard for this land. He would have been glad about this. She was sure of that. She put the order in the box where she kept the important papers, and she went outside where Wallace was splitting wood in the yard with Benjamin attempting to do the same with a much smaller piece, and she said, "It's over." The order came through. Wallace set down the splitting axe and looked at her. Benjamin's face broke into a grin. "So we keep the water?" Benjamin asked. "We keep the water," Clara said. Wallace crossed the yard and she met him in the middle of it, and he put his arms around her and she pressed her face against his chest for a moment, just a moment, and felt the solidness of him and the relief of being held and the truth that things could, in fact, come right. "Now then," he said into her hair. "Now then," she agreed. February moved toward March, and with it came the questions. Wallace had spoken to Dan Hollies about his situation at the Double H, and Hollies, who was a decent man and a perceptive one, had said without a great deal of preamble that if Wallace had a mind to settle somewhere locally, he was welcome to buy the section of land on the Double H's eastern boundary, which Hollies had been meaning to sell off for years. It was 20 acres, good land, with a small creek of its own and an old structure that could be rebuilt into a house without too much difficulty. Wallace brought this to Clara one evening. He sat across from her at the kitchen table and he put his hands flat on the table and he said, "I want to ask you something, and I want to be clear that the answer either way doesn't change anything about how I feel, but I want to ask." Clara looked at him with the direct clarity that had become her natural mode with him. "Ask it." "I want to marry you," he said. "Not as a solution to any problem and not because it's practical, though it happens to be both those things. Because I want to spend my life with you and Benjamin, and I love you more than I've loved anything in my adult life, and I am done wandering, and this is where I want to be." She looked at him for a long time. The fire was burning. Benjamin was asleep. The February wind moved outside the windows, and inside was warm and still. "Thomas has been gone less than a year," she said. "People will talk." "People talked when you stood up at the town meeting," he said. "You did it anyway." She almost smiled. She had known she was going to say yes from before he had finished asking, which she thought he probably knew, but it mattered to her to sit with it for a moment and be sure not just with her feelings but with the whole of herself, the practical and the careful and the grieving and the hopeful, all of it. "Yes," she said. He breathed out. Something eased in his whole body, the kind of ease that comes from being in suspense about the most important thing and then being released from it. He reached across the table and took both her hands. "I'm going to talk to Hollies about the land tomorrow," he said. "And I'll talk to Benjamin," she said. Benjamin's response to the news, delivered the next morning over oatmeal, was a silence of approximately 4 seconds followed by, "So Wallace will live here." "He'll live on the land next to us," Clara said, watching her son carefully. "And he and I will be married, which means he'll be my father," Benjamin asked. His voice was careful, measuring something. Clara chose her words with equal care. "He will be your stepfather. Your father was Thomas Hart and he loved you very much and that doesn't change, but Wallace loves you too and he'll be here and he'll be part of our family." Benjamin looked at his oatmeal. He was quiet for a long moment and Clara let him be quiet because she had learned that he needed space to think things through. "Wallace knows how to throw a loop," Benjamin said finally. "He does," Clara agreed. "Will he teach me?" "I think if you asked him he would be very glad to." Benjamin nodded once, with the decisive air of someone who has completed a complex calculation. "Okay," he said, and went back to his oatmeal. When Wallace came that afternoon and Clara told him about Benjamin's response, something crossed Wallace's face that was deep and raw and quickly composed, and he said very quietly, "I'm going to do right by him." "I know that," Clara said. "I wouldn't have said yes if I didn't." They were married in April at the church with the crooked steeple, on a day that had the particular lucid sweetness of a Texas spring morning, the air warm and bright and full of the smell of cedar and wildflowers. Clara wore her best dress, which Martha Dunn had helped her alter and add new lace to, and she carried a small bunch of bluebonnets that Benjamin had picked that morning from the field behind the house. Wallace stood at the front of the church in a new suit he had bought from the tailor in the next town, looking slightly more formal than she was accustomed to seeing him and slightly uncertain about it. And when she walked down the aisle, he looked at her with the expression of a man who cannot quite believe his luck and also very much can. Horace Prout was not in attendance, which nobody remarked upon. Martha Dunn was in the front row and made no attempt to hide that she was crying. Dan Holly stood up as Wallace's witness, a big weathered man who kept clapping Wallace on the shoulder at intervals throughout the ceremony with the warm aggression of a man who wants to express great feeling and does not quite know how. The minister read the ceremony, and when he got to the part where he asked if anyone had objection, Clara heard Wallace's breath catch slightly, and she glanced at him and his eyes were dancing, and she had to press her lips together to hold back a laugh. Nobody objected. She said her vows clearly, looking at him, and he said his looking at her, and when the minister said he could kiss his bride, Wallace stepped forward and kissed her with a gentleness and a certainty that told her everything she already knew. Benjamin, standing beside them as they had agreed he would, tugged on Wallace's sleeve immediately after. "Does this mean I can call you Pa?" he asked. There was a sound from Martha Dunn that was somewhere between a laugh and a sob. Wallace crouched down to Benjamin's eye level right there at the altar in his new suit. "Only if you want to," he said. Benjamin considered this with his customary 4-second deliberation. "I want to," he said. Wallace put his hand on the boy's shoulder, and the three of them stood in the church with the April light coming through the windows, and Clara looked at them both and felt the fullness of it, not the absence of grief, because Thomas would always be with her in the particular way that the dead remain with us, but alongside it, not replacing it but coexisting with it, a new and solid joy. The summer that followed was the first good one Clara had known in more than a year. Wallace bought the eastern parcel from Dan Holly's and began rebuilding the old structure with the methodical energy he brought to every practical task, working on it in the mornings before coming to Clara's farm for the afternoon work. He was a skilled builder, as he was skilled at most things he turned his hand to, and the house took shape through June and July, acquiring a porch and 2 windows and a roof that did not leak. Clara contributed to the decisions and helped where she could on the weekends, and Benjamin contributed to the decisions emphatically and sometimes helpfully. But they had agreed, with a practicality that Clara appreciated, that they would not move into the new house immediately. The farm was Clara's primary concern, the 40 acres Thomas had loved, and there was wisdom in staying close to it during the rebuilding period. So Wallace moved his things to the farm, into the room that had been the storage room, and which they cleared and cleaned together one afternoon, while Benjamin ran enthusiastic errands between them. And the new house on the eastern parcel became the building project that Wallace worked on steadily through the summer and fall with the longer-term plan of having it ready by the following spring. In the meantime, they were a household. It was something that took adjustment, not in ways that were painful, but in the everyday particular ways that 2 people who have lived independently for years adjust to the rhythms of another person, the small negotiations of mornings and evenings, who did what in the order it needed to be done, what they liked to talk about at the end of the day and what they liked to let alone. They were both people who valued plain speaking, which helped. When something needed saying, they said it, and when they disagreed, they argued it out with the kind of thorough mutual respect that made disagreement generative rather than corrosive. They were deeply, plainly happy. Clara recognized it clearly enough to know it and to be grateful for it, which was a kind of maturity that grief had given her, the understanding that happiness is not a permanent condition, but a condition to be recognized and inhabited fully when it arrives. Wallace rode into town with her on Saturday mornings, and she loved the ease of it, the 2 of them on the wagon seat with Benjamin in the back, the familiar route becoming familiar in a new way now that she was not making it alone. In town there was a quality of regard that was new also. She had been a widow alone, which was a particular thing in a small town, a kind of settled sympathy that was well-meaning, but that also had a slight quality of written-off. Now she was a woman with a husband who stood up for her, literally, and people related to her differently. Some of the men who had nodded along when Prout had told her to sit down went out of their way to be cordial, which she noticed, and did not make a scene about but also did not forget. Martha Dunn was her closest friend through this period, coming out to the farm on afternoons when her husband could mind the store, and on one such afternoon in August, sitting on the porch with the heat of the day beginning to ease toward evening, Martha said with her customary directness, "You're going to be having a baby." Clara looked at her. "I haven't said anything." "You haven't had to," Martha said placidly. Clara had suspected for several weeks. She had not yet told Wallace, partly because she was being careful about timing, and partly because the magnitude of it required a moment of deliberate choice about how to hold it before sharing it. She had been holding it for 2 weeks, and the holding of it had been mostly wonderful and occasionally terrifying in the way that all enormous good things are terrifying when you have known loss. That evening she told him. They were in the kitchen after Benjamin's bedtime, the window open to the warm August dark, moths circling the lamp, and she said simply, "I'm expecting." Wallace was completely still for several seconds. She watched his face move through something she could not quite read, which was unusual because she had become good at reading him, and then he stood up and came around the table, and he pulled her carefully to her feet and held her with a steadiness that told her everything his silence was taking longer to say. "When?" he managed. "February," she said. "Perhaps March." He held her for a long time. She could feel him thinking, the particular quality of his concentration finding its way even into the way he held her. Finally he said, roughly and honestly, "I am so glad." "I am too," she said. "I was scared to be, but I am." He pulled back far enough to look at her. Scared of what? She considered how honest to be and decided on entirely. That it felt like too much good too fast, that I was overreaching. "You're not overreaching," he said, with the quiet certainty of a man who has thought about this from every direction. "You're just living." Benjamin's reaction to the news of a new sibling was electric. He spent a full day asking extremely specific questions about the baby, including several that neither Clara nor Wallace could adequately answer. And then he spent the next week telling every person he encountered in Redemption Creek about it, with the proprietary pride of someone who feels they are partly responsible for a significant development. The fall of 1883 passed in a golden blur of farm work and house building, and the ordinary extraordinary dailiness of their life. Wallace finished the eastern parcel house by November, which they had decided would become the house that Clara's farm hand Ezra, who had been renting a room in town at some expense, would use when the spring brought more work. It was a good solution, practical and fair, the kind of thinking that Wallace was particularly good at, seeing how pieces could be arranged to benefit everyone rather than just the obvious party. Clara's farm continued to produce well. The water rights were secure. The mortgage payments to the Austin Land Bank were steady. She had expanded the kitchen garden to include more variety, and the preserves she made in the fall had become something of a known quantity in town, sold through the general store in the amber-lit jars that people recognized and asked for by name. She had a small reputation now, separate from the reputation of Thomas's widow or the woman from the town meeting, a reputation of her own making and her own earning. The baby came in early March of 1884, a boy, arriving with the decisive purposefulness of a person who has made up his mind. Wallace was present for the birth, which was not the common practice but which he simply declined to leave the room for, standing at Clara's side with the quiet, steady presence he brought to everything. And when the baby came, he was the one who said, with a raw simplicity that the attending midwife, old Mrs. Pike, would tell people about for years, "He's here. He's perfect. You did it." They named him Thomas Wallace Hart Atkins, which was a long name for a small boy, and Benjamin immediately shortened it to Tommy, and it stuck. Tommy was a loud, cheerful, insistently energetic infant who became a loud, cheerful, insistently energetic baby with the same dark eyes as his father, and the same set determination about the jaw as his mother. And the household arranged itself around him, with the good-natured exhaustion of households everywhere that contain a new small person who has not yet learned that nighttime is for sleeping. Wallace took night shifts with the thoroughness of a man who understood that equal partnership meant equal inconvenience, and Clara, watching him walk the kitchen floor at 2 in the morning with Tommy on his shoulder, singing under his breath in the tuneless but earnest way he had, felt a love for him so acute it was almost difficult to hold. Spring came to Redemption Creek in the way it always did, with a sudden rush of color from the wildflowers that came every year and never stopped being beautiful. Benjamin was 8 now, and serious about his schoolwork in the way Clara had raised him to be, and he had taken on several farm responsibilities with a pride of ownership that she recognized as Thomas's trait, the same deep satisfaction in work, done well on land that was theirs. On an April morning that smelled exactly like their wedding morning had, Clara stood at the edge of the farm and looked at the 40 acres. The creek ran along the western boundary, clear and reliable, the water rights protected and documented and secure. The kitchen garden was planted. The barn was in good repair. The house stood solid and whitewashed in hers. Behind her in the house, Tommy was making his morning sounds, and in a few minutes Benjamin would be coming down for breakfast, and Wallace was already in the yard, beginning the morning tasks with the quiet efficiency that she had come to love as one of the things that defined her days. She had been thinking lately about what it meant to speak. Not just at town meetings, though she intended to keep doing that, particularly since Horace Prout had retired from the chairmanship in January, and his replacement was a younger man named Carter who had the decency to not interrupt people when they were making valid points. She had been thinking about it in a larger way, about what it had cost her to raise her voice in that room, and what it had meant that someone had stood up and refused to let the room silence her, and what that combination had unlocked. Not just the practical outcomes, the water rights and the mortgage and all the measurable things, but something less measurable, something about who she was allowed to be. She heard Wallace come up behind her. He stood beside her and followed her gaze across the 40 acres. "What are you thinking?" he asked. "That I have everything I need," she said. He put his arm around her shoulders, the familiar weight and warmth of him, and he said, "I know what you mean. I also think," she said, "that we should consider the corner section next to the creek for a small orchard, peaches maybe, and apples." He turned to look at her with the smile she had come to think of as hers specifically, the one that appeared when she had said something that delighted him. "Give me the dimensions and I'll start laying it out tomorrow." She leaned into him slightly. Tommy's sounds from the house were escalating toward the specific register that meant he wanted his breakfast. "Come on," she said. "Let's go start the day." They walked back across the yard together in the April morning light. And inside the house, Benjamin had already come down and was talking to Tommy in the voice he used for the baby, informative and slightly self-important, explaining something about the farm that Tommy could not possibly understand and was receiving with the open-mouthed wonder that babies receive everything. Wallace went to the stove and Clara went to Tommy, and the morning gathered itself into the necessary, beautiful, ordinary work of it. The cooking and the feeding and the planning and the small negotiations, and the love that ran through all of it like the creek ran through the land, constant and sustaining and hers. There were still things that were not easy. The world was not transformed simply because she had won one fight. There were other women in Redemption Creek who were silenced in other rooms, and Clara had begun to be attentive to that, had begun to be the person who noticed and sometimes said something, who created the small openings that others might step through. She was not by nature a crusader. She was too practical for crusading, which required a particular relationship to inefficiency that she could not quite afford. But she was someone who had learned that a clear voice in the right moment at the right volume could change the direction of a room, and she used that knowledge deliberately. She served on the school committee, where she was one of 2 women among 7 members, and she argued competently and persistently for the things she believed in, and over the first year, she won enough of them to feel that the effort was worthwhile. She became known in the particular small-town way as someone whose opinion was sound and whose word meant something. This was a reputation that pleased her because it was one she had built herself, and because Thomas would have been proud of it. Wallace rebuilt the farm's eastern fence in the summer, a project that Benjamin helped with extensively and which they finished in 3 days of companionable work. And afterward they sat on the porch in the long light of the August evening, all 4 of them, Tommy in Clara's lap and Benjamin, cross-legged on the floor, and Wallace in the old wooden chair that had been Thomas's and which he had occupied for the past year, and made his own with the ordinary use of it. They sat in the evening quiet, the kind of quiet that only exists in the country, full of the sounds of insects and wind and the distant settling of the land, and it was one of those moments that Clara filed away with the other best moments, the one she returned to in the quieter, darker times that still came and always would. "Pa," Benjamin said, and it was still a small miracle every time, the ease with which the word had become natural in his mouth. Wallace said, which was his sound of attention. "When Tommy's older, can we teach him to ride? When Tommy's old enough to sit up straight for more than 10 minutes together, yes," Wallace said. Benjamin considered this, glancing at Tommy, who was currently attempting to eat Clara's braid with focused determination. "That might be a while," he said judiciously. "It will be a while," Wallace agreed. Tommy, as though aware he was being discussed, looked up from his project and produced a wide and entirely unprovoked grin. "He knows we're talking about him," Benjamin said, delighted. "He doesn't miss much," Clara said. "He gets that from someone." Wallace made a sound of transparent innocence. The years moved as years do, with the particular combination of sameness and change that makes the passing of time feel both swift and ample when you look back at it from the other end. Tommy grew from an imperious baby to an adventurous toddler to a small boy who followed Benjamin everywhere with the devotion of younger siblings. And Benjamin endured this following with a patience that only occasionally required maternal mediation. The farm produced well, better than it ever had under Thomas's stewardship, partly because Clara had learned more than Thomas had known about certain aspects of cultivation, and partly because Wallace had brought practical knowledge from the survey work that let them optimize the water use from the creek in ways that the previous irrigation channel had not allowed for. Gerald Morrow sold his interests in Redemption Creek and moved to San Antonio in the fall of 1884, which was something the town noted with a general feeling of relief that was politely not expressed very loudly. His bank was bought by a pair of brothers from Dallas who were strict but fair, and who had no particular interest in creative arrangements involving water rights and mortgages. The Redemption Creek Savings and Land Trust became an ordinary institution doing ordinary business, which was all it had ever needed to be. Horace Prout, in retirement, took up vegetable gardening and became so absorbed in it that he occasionally appeared at the general store with such evident pride in his tomatoes that even people who remembered him telling Clara Hart to sit down found it difficult to dislike him entirely. Clara did not make it easy for him, particularly, but she was not a person who carried grudges as a practice. She acknowledged him when they met and did not go out of her way in either direction, which she thought was about right. On a day in the September of 1885, Clara was in the kitchen putting up the last of the peach preserves from the first year of the orchard's production. The trees had taken well, 12 of them along the creek side, heavy with small sweet peaches that she had been picking for 3 weeks, when Wallace came in from the yard and stood in the doorway. There was something in his expression, a particular quality of attentiveness, that made her look up. "What?" she said. He crossed the room and sat down at the table. He was 37 now, the lines of his face a little deeper, a strand of gray at his temple that she had noticed appear over the past year and privately found very appealing. He looked at her with the eyes that had told her the truth at every turn since the beginning. "I've been offered something," he said. She set down the jar she was holding and gave him her full attention. "Dan Hollies is selling the Double H," he said. "His health has gotten bad this year, you've noticed that. His sons are in Houston and they have no interest in the land. He's asked me if I want to buy it." Clara was quiet for a moment. "That's a large operation," she said. "It is," Wallace said. 40 acres more than ours plus the cattle operation. It would be a considerable expansion. He looked at her. "I told him I needed to talk to you first." She looked at him steadily. "What do you want to do?" "I want what you think makes sense," he said. "It's not just my decision." She turned this over. The Double H was good land and she knew its quality well from the 3 years Wallace had worked it. Combined with their 40 acres, it would make a substantial holding. The cattle operation would require hired help, more than they currently had. The capital outlay would stretch them, though the Austin Land Bank had been accommodating with them before. It was a risk, but it was a real one, not a reckless one. "Can we make the numbers work?" she asked. "I've been looking at them for a week," he said. "I think so, carefully." "Then let's do it carefully," she said. He looked at her for a moment with the expression she knew well, the one that was just love, plain and direct and consistent. "I'll tell Hollies tomorrow," he said. The acquisition of the Double H took the fall of 1885 to complete, all the paperwork and negotiation and arrangement that such things require, and it changed the scale of their operation considerably. They hired two good hands. One, a young man named Pete, who was 18 and energetic, and reminded Clara slightly of Thomas in his approach to work, which was wholehearted and sometimes reckless, and one, an older hand named Cordell, who had been with the Double H for 8 years, and knew the cattle and the land with the particular intimacy of long experience. With Ezra, who had been with them since the beginning, that made 3 hired hands, which was a payroll that required careful management, but which the combined operation could sustain. Wallace was a good employer. Clara had noticed this from the beginning, the way he treated the people who worked for them with the same plain directness he brought to everything, no condescension, no false authority. He explained what he needed clearly and he paid on time, and he did not ask anything of them that he would not do himself. The men liked him for it and worked hard, which was the only reliable result of treating people well. The winter of 1885 was a cold one, and they spent a great deal of it inside, which suited Clara in some ways because Tommy, now a year and a half old, was in a phase of development that required extremely active attention, and having Wallace present for more of the day in the worst of the weather distributed the work in a way that she appreciated. In the evenings they read the Tennyson and other books that Wallace had acquired over the years, a small but good collection that had grown to fill one shelf of the bookcase he had built into the main room's wall. Clara had added to it with her own preferences, practical books on cultivation and preserving, and a novel or two that she allowed herself as an occasional indulgence, and a history of Texas that she found herself returning to for reasons she found hard to articulate, except that it seemed important to understand the land you lived on, its full history, and not just the parts that were comfortable. She was thinking about history more broadly than that, if she was honest with herself. The land they farmed and now expanded into had been other people's land before it was what it had become, and that was a fact that she held with the careful honesty she tried to bring to everything. The settlements that had pushed west through Texas in the decades before and during her lifetime had done so at costs that were borne by people who had not chosen to pay them. The Comanche and the Tonkawa and others whose presence and dispossession were facts that the town of Redemption Creek did not much discuss. She was not sure what to do with this knowledge exactly, except to hold it and not pretend it wasn't there, which seemed like the minimum that honesty required. She mentioned it to Wallace one evening, expecting either agreement or a desire to change the subject. He did not change the subject. He said he had been thinking about it too, had been thinking about it since the survey years, when he had moved through landscapes where the evidence of what had been there before was everywhere if you knew how to read it. He did not have a resolution to offer her. He said, "I think the honest thing is to not look away from it, and that seems like where you are already." She loved him for not making it simple. It was not simple. She held it the way she held the other big things, with attention and without resolution, because not everything resolves. In the spring of 1886, Clara discovered she was expecting again. She told Wallace in the evening simply, over the kitchen table, and he received it with the same quiet, profound gladness he had shown the first time, perhaps deeper for being the second. Tommy was 2. A small force of nature who was just beginning to put sentences together with startling effectiveness. Benjamin was 9 and increasingly his own person, with definite opinions and a growing interest in how things worked mechanically that seemed distinct from either his father Thomas's agricultural bent or Wallace's practical versatility. This baby was a girl, born in the November of 1886, on a cold, bright morning that Clara would always remember as having a particular clarity to it, the light very sharp through the bedroom window, the sounds of the farm coming in from outside with the quality of something familiar and beloved. They named her Ruth, after Wallace's mother, which was his suggestion, and which Clara recognized as a measure of what his mother had meant to him and was glad to give. Ruth was from the beginning a contained person, quiet where Tommy was loud, observant where he was active, and the two of them together made a combination that was exhausting and delightful in equal measure. Benjamin took to Ruth with the same tender earnestness he had brought to Tommy, and there was a quality in his care for his younger siblings that made Clara's heart expand every time she saw it, because he was so entirely Thomas's son in the combination of work and love. Redemption Creek grew through the late 1880s, as Texas grew. The cattle trails that had once been the main drivers of economic life in the hill country were giving way to the railroads, which changed things, and not always gently. There were years of harder weather and harder markets, and there were years that were good. Clara and Wallace navigated all of it together, with the practical intelligence they both had and the accumulated knowledge of 7 years building something together. The town itself was changing. New families arrived. Some of the old families moved on to cities or to other territories. The school expanded. A second church was built, which prompted a brief civic controversy that Clara served on a committee to resolve. The general store was rebuilt after a fire in 1887, and Martha Dunn supervised the reconstruction with the authority of a general, and the result was a store that was larger and better lit, and which contained, for the first time, a proper corner where books could be purchased, which was entirely Martha's idea, and which Clara regarded as the best addition to Redemption Creek in years. On a Sunday morning in the spring of 1889, Clara stood on the steps of the church after the service with Wallace beside her and Ruth in his arms and Tommy and Benjamin, conducting some negotiation of their own on the steps below, and she looked out at the street of Redemption Creek with the cedar hills behind it and the wide sky above it, and the familiar faces of people she had known for the better part of a decade. She had been thinking about the town meeting. She thought about it sometimes, the particular quality of that moment, the way she had risen to her feet and the room had tried to push her back down with the combined weight of its expectation, and the way one voice from the back had said simply, "Let her speak." She thought about what it had cost and what it had given back, not just to her, but in the small ways such moments travel through communities, loosening things that were too tight, making small openings where before there had been wall. She had spoken at several town meetings since then. She was not always right about everything she said, and she had learned to hold that possibility without being paralyzed by it. But she spoke, and she had not been asked to sit down again, and she thought there was some chance that other women in the room had noted that, had filed it away in the same way she had filed away the feeling of being heard. Wallace's hand found hers as it did. "Ready?" he said. She looked at him. He was wearing his Sunday coat and he had shaved, and his dark eyes had the particular expression that was just contentment, the expression of a man who has arrived where he meant to be and knows it. Ruth was pulling at his collar with the focused determination of a 2-year-old who has decided something should come apart, and he was letting her with the patient amusement that he brought to all of the children's more emphatic projects. "Ready," she said. They walked down the steps into the Sunday morning, the 5 of them, and the spring light fell across Redemption Creek the way it had every spring since long before any of them had arrived here, indifferent and beautiful and entirely generous, asking nothing, giving everything, and Clara walked through it with her hand in Wallace's and felt, without reservation or anxiety, completely and thoroughly and wholly well. The farm that autumn produced better than any year before it. The peach orchard, now 4 years old, was at its full first maturity, the trees heavy and reliable. Clara's preserves had been picked up by a distributor who sold to towns along the rail line, a small commercial venture that generated a separate income, she had started putting aside for Benjamin's education. Because he was 12 now, and showing every sign of being the kind of person who would want and use an education beyond what Redemption Creek School could give him. Wallace had said nothing about Benjamin's future except that whatever the boy wanted to try for, they would help him get there, and the certainty in his voice when he said it had been one of those moments Clara recognized and filed. On a November evening when the children were in bed, and the house was quiet with the specific quality of peace that follows a long working day, Clara sat at the kitchen table with the lamp and the small leather-bound ledger she kept the farm accounts in. The numbers were good. The mortgage was on track. The cattle operation had had a solid year. The preserves venture had cleared a modest profit for the first time. She went through the columns with the careful pleasure of a person who takes satisfaction in order, and when she reached the final totals she set down the pen and sat for a moment with the wholeness of it. Wallace came in from checking on the horses and stamped the cold off his boots and poured a cup of coffee and came to sit across from her. He looked at her face and then at the ledger. "Good," he said. "Very good," she said. He nodded, his hands around the cup, the lamplight catching the gray at his temples. "Spring," he said. "I'd like to add more cattle. Pete has been doing good work with the herd management. I think we can carry 20 more head without overextending." "Talk me through the numbers tomorrow," she said. "I want to think it through." "Of course," he said. She looked at him across the table. The lamp burned between them the same as it had on 100 evenings, the same yellow warmth. From somewhere in the house came the sound of one of the children shifting in sleep, a small sound that settled quickly back into quiet. "Wallace," she said, "I want to tell you something." He looked up from his coffee cup with the eyes that paid attention. "I think about that night a lot," she said. "The town meeting, what it felt like when Prout told me to sit down, and what it felt like when you didn't let him." She paused, looking for the right precision. "I don't know that I would have kept fighting without that. For the water, for the land, for any of it. I might have, I hope I would have, but I know that the moment you said those words, something changed. I believed I had the right to be heard, and from that belief came everything else." He was very quiet. His hands were still around the cup. "I just want you to know," she said, "that when I say I love you, this is part of what I mean. The whole of what happened. What we built from it, what you stood up for before you had any reason to stand up for it." "I had a reason," he said. "You didn't know me," she said. "I knew enough," he said. "I knew you were right and you were being silenced, and those two things together are more than enough of a reason." She looked at him for a long time. The lamp, the coffee cup, the quiet house and the quiet farm and the life they had made in this particular piece of the world. "Come to bed," she said. He finished his coffee and set the cup down and put out the lamp, and they walked through the dark house together, the familiar dark of home, the floorboards familiar under their feet, and outside the November wind moved through the Texas night with its ancient indifference and its ancient comfort both at once. And Clara Hart, who was also Clara Atkins now, who had been Thomas Hart's wife and was now Wallace Atkins's wife, who had stood up in a courthouse in the autumn of 1882 and raised her voice and refused to be silent, lay in the dark with her husband's arm around her and listened to her house breathe. Benjamin slept in his room down the hall, growing toward the man he would become, carrying Thomas in the set of his jaw and Wallace in the set of his character and Clara and all the rest of it. Tommy slept in the room next to Ruth, two small people who were accumulating days and experiences and would grow up in a family built from loss and courage and the particular stubbornness of love. Outside the farm sat in the November dark, and the creek ran along its western boundary without stopping, as it always had, as it would go on doing long after all of them were gone, and the 40 acres rested under the stars in the easy permanence of good land loved and tended and fought for. In the morning she would rise and light the stove, and the children would come down, and Wallace would bring the horses in, and the work of the day would begin again, as it always did, as it would again and again and again, the beautiful, ordinary, extraordinary work of a life fully and deliberately chosen. That was enough. That was everything. that was more than enough.